Kindness is expensive, my mother used to say, and the bill always comes later. I didn't understand what she meant until the night I heard a little girl crying behind a flickering streetlight at 10:47 p.m., halfway down a narrow alley that smelled like rain and old concrete. The kind of place most people walk past a little faster without thinking twice. The kind of place I should have ignored after a 12-hour shift that left my feet aching and my coffee cold in my hand. But I didn't keep walking. I slowed, then stopped, because the sound wasn't just crying, it was that sharp, uneven kind of breath that comes when someone is trying not to be heard. And when I turned the corner, I saw her, small, maybe 7 or 8, clutching a worn backpack to her chest while 3 older kids circled her like they had nowhere else to be and nothing better to do. Their voices low and taunting, their shadows stretching long across the wet pavement. And for a second I told myself it wasn't my business, that someone else would step in, that I was too tired, too late, too alone. But my feet didn't listen. They never do when something feels wrong. And before I could rethink it, I heard my own voice cut through the alley. Quieter than I expected, but steady enough. Hey, leave her alone. And every head turned toward me at once, the moment stretching thin as paper, my pulse picking up like it knew I had just made a mistake I couldn't take back. One of them laughed under his breath. Another tilted his head like he was trying to decide if I was serious, and I felt it then. That shift in the air when attention locks onto you and doesn't let go. But the girl looked at me like I was the only exit in a room with no doors, so I stepped closer anyway, slow, careful, like I was walking into something I didn't understand yet. She didn't do anything. I added, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag just to keep them from shaking, and one of them shrugged like it didn't matter, like none of this mattered. But they didn't leave, not right away, and that was when I realized this wasn't going to end with just words, not clean, not easy, not forgettable. Somewhere behind me a car engine idled low and smooth, too quiet for this street, too still, like it had been there longer than I'd noticed. But I didn't turn around, not yet, because the girl took a small step toward me, and I moved without thinking, placing myself between her and them, feeling the weight of that choice settle in my chest, heavy and final, the kind you don't get to undo. And as the rain started again, soft at first, tapping against the pavement and the metal trash cans lining the alley, I understood something I hadn't before, that doing the right thing doesn't feel brave in the moment. It feels like standing still when every instinct tells you to run, and I stayed, even when I knew this night wasn't going to end the way I thought it would. One of them took a step forward, slow enough to feel intentional, like he wanted me to notice every inch of distance closing between us. And I felt the girl's hand brush against my sleeve, light but desperate, and that was enough to anchor me in place even when my heartbeat started climbing into my throat. "We are just talking," he said, casual, almost bored, like I had interrupted something harmless. But the way the others shifted their weight, the way their attention stayed fixed on me, told a different story, and I shook my head before I could second-guess it. "Then you are done talking," I said, softer this time, because volume was not going to help me here. And for a second nothing moved, no one spoke, just the sound of rain picking up, tapping faster against the pavement, against the metal dumpster behind them, against the hood of that car still idling somewhere behind me. And I wondered who sat inside it, who chose to stay instead of drive away, but I kept my eyes forward, because turning my back felt like losing control of the only thing I still had, which was presence. And then one of them exhaled sharply, like I was not worth the effort, and he shrugged, nudging the others with a look that said this was over, not because I had won, but because they had decided it was not worth continuing. And just like that the circle broke, footsteps retreating, voices fading into something quieter, something distant, until it was just me and the girl standing under that flickering light, my shoulders still tense, waiting for the moment it would start again. But it did not. And when I finally let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, it came out uneven, almost shaky, and I turned to her slowly, lowering myself just enough to meet her eyes without towering over her. "Hey, you are okay," I said, even though I had no way to guarantee that. And she nodded too fast, like she was trying to convince both of us, her fingers still gripping the strap of her backpack so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. "What is your name?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, grounded, something she could hold on to. "Lily," she whispered, and I repeated it softly, like saying it made it real, like it meant something. Lily, I am Emily. I am going to walk you home, okay? And she hesitated, just for a second, before nodding again. And when her small hand slipped into mine, it felt colder than it should have, like she had been standing there longer than I wanted to imagine. So I stood, adjusting my pace to hers as we moved out of the alley and back toward the street where the lights were brighter, where the world felt more normal, even if my chest had not caught up yet, even if every passing car made me glance twice without meaning to. And as we reached the corner, I finally allowed myself to look back, just once, expecting nothing, and still catching it, the black car. Parked exactly where I had heard it, windows dark, impossible to see through, but unmistakably there, like it had been watching the entire time. And for a second, just a second, I felt something shift again, that quiet awareness of being seen, measured, remembered, before the engine hummed lower and the car pulled away without a sound, disappearing into the night like it had never been there at all. And I told myself it did not matter, that the only thing that mattered was the girl beside me. Her grip still tight around my hand, her steps small but steady. And yet as we walked the 3 blocks to her building, as she pointed to a worn front door under a dim porch light, and whispered that she could make it from there, I could not shake the feeling that something had already been set in motion, something I did not understand yet, something that did not end when the alley went quiet. Because when I let go of her hand and watched her disappear inside, safe for now, I realized my mother had been wrong about one thing. Kindness does not just come with a cost. Sometimes it comes with consequences you never see coming. I thought going home would quiet everything, that a hot shower and a locked door would reset the night back into something normal. But it did not work like that. Not when your body still remembers the tension long after the moment has passed. And as I stepped into my apartment, dropping my bag by the door and kicking off my shoes, I realized how loud silence can be when your mind refuses to slow down. Every small sound sharper than it should be. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, even the soft drip of water from my jacket onto the tile floor. And I stood there for a minute longer than necessary, just listening, like I expected something to follow me inside, like the night had not finished with me yet, and that thought should have felt irrational. But it did not. Not after the way that car had waited, not after the way it left without a sound, like it had already seen everything it needed to see. And I shook my head, trying to push it away, telling myself it was nothing, just someone parked, just coincidence. But the feeling stayed, quiet and persistent, like a question I could not answer. So I moved through my routine anyway, turning on the shower, letting the steam fill the small bathroom, watching the mirror blur until my own reflection disappeared. And for a moment that helped. The warmth, the noise, something steady and predictable, something I could control. But even then my mind kept circling back to Lily, to the way her hand had felt in mine, too cold, too tight. And I wondered where her parents were, if they knew where she had been, if this was something that happened often enough that she had learned not to expect help. And that thought sat heavier than anything else, because it meant tonight had not been random for her. It had been familiar, and I stayed under the water longer than I should have, letting that realization settle in a way I could not quite shake, until the heat started to fade and reality crept back in, slow and unavoidable. And when I finally stepped out, wrapping a towel around my shoulders, my phone buzzed on the counter, sharp enough to make me pause, because I had not expected anyone to call this late. And for a second I just stared at it, watching the screen light up against the dim room. An unknown number, no name, no context, and something about that made my chest tighten again. Not fear exactly, but awareness, like the night was reaching back toward me in a way I had not prepared for. And I told myself not to answer, that it was probably nothing, a wrong number, a late notification, something simple and forgettable. But my hand moved anyway, picking it up before I could stop myself, pressing accept before logic had a chance to catch up. And for a moment there was only silence on the other end, not empty, not disconnected, just quiet in a way that felt intentional, controlled, like someone was there, listening, waiting. And I found myself holding my breath without meaning to, my voice coming out softer than I intended when I finally spoke. Hello. And the silence stretched just long enough to feel deliberate before a voice answered, low, calm, and measured in a way that did not rush, did not hesitate. You should not walk alone at night. And every muscle in my body went still, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, like it was not a suggestion, not a warning, but a statement of fact, something already decided, and I swallowed, my grip tightening slightly on the phone, trying to place the voice, trying to understand how a stranger could sound like he already knew something about me, something I had not shared. And before I could respond, before I could ask the question forming in my throat, the line went dead, just like that. No explanation, no goodbye, just silence again, heavier this time. Final, and I stood there in the middle of my apartment, phone still pressed to my ear, realizing that whatever had started in that alley had not ended when I walked away. It had followed me home, quietly, carefully, and it was no longer something I could ignore. I did not sleep that night, not really. I closed my eyes, turned off the lights, even lay still long enough for the room to settle into that quiet early morning silence. But my mind kept replaying the same moments in sharp fragments. The alley, Lily's voice, the car, that voice on the phone, calm and certain in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And every time I drifted close to sleep, something pulled me back, like my body refused to fully relax when it sensed something unfinished, something unresolved. So by the time sunlight pushed through the thin gap in my blinds at 6:32 a.m., I was already awake, staring at the ceiling like I had been waiting for morning to confirm that everything still made sense. But it did not completely, because even in daylight the memory did not feel smaller. It felt clearer, sharper, and I moved through my routine slower than usual, brushing my teeth, tying my hair back, pouring coffee I barely tasted, all while my phone sat on the counter exactly where I left it, silent now, like the call had never happened, like I could pretend it was just a wrong number if I wanted to. But I did not pick it up, not yet, because part of me did not want to see anything new on that screen, did not want confirmation that something was still watching, still aware. And when I finally stepped outside, locking my door behind me, the air felt different, colder than it should have been for that time of year. Or maybe that was just me, noticing things I normally would not. The way a car slowed at the corner before turning, the way someone across the street paused just a second too long before walking again. And I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into ordinary details. But awareness once triggered does not turn off easily. It lingers, it sharpens everything. And as I walked the 6 blocks to the small clinic where I worked, I caught myself checking reflections in store windows without meaning to, adjusting my pace when footsteps echoed behind me. Not out of fear, exactly, but out of a need to stay ahead of whatever this was, whatever had started last night. And when I reached the building, pushing open the glass door and stepping into the familiar scent of antiseptic and coffee, something inside me finally eased, just a little, because this place made sense, it followed rules, it stayed predictable, and for a moment I almost convinced myself that I could leave everything else outside, that whatever had happened belonged to a different version of the night. Not this morning, not this life, but that illusion lasted less than 10 seconds, because as I moved toward the front desk, setting my bag down and glancing at the clipboard of scheduled patients, I noticed something out of place, a small white envelope sitting neatly on top, no stamp, no address, just my name written across the front in clean, deliberate handwriting, Emily Carter, and I stopped without touching it, my fingers hovering just inches away as that same quiet awareness settled back into my chest, heavier now, more certain, because this was not coincidence. This was intention, precise and measured, the kind that does not rush or guess, the kind that already knows exactly where to find you. And for a moment I considered leaving it there, pretending I had not seen it. But curiosity is a stronger force than caution when the unknown starts to take shape. So I picked it up slowly, feeling the weight of it, light, almost nothing, and when I opened it, sliding a single folded card out from inside. The message was short, written in the same controlled script, no hesitation in the ink, no wasted words, just a single line that made everything inside me go still again. You did the right thing. And beneath it, no name, no signature, just a symbol pressed faintly into the paper, something I did not recognize but somehow understood carried meaning. The kind of meaning that does not need explanation, and I stood there longer than I should have, staring at those words, realizing that whatever this was, whoever he was not just aware of what happened. He had been there, watching, deciding, and for the first time since last night, a different thought surfaced, quieter, but more dangerous than fear, because it was not about what had already happened. It was about what came next, and whether I had just stepped into something I could not step out of. I folded the card back along its crease slower than necessary, like delaying the moment would somehow change what it meant, but the words stayed the same, simple, controlled, final, and I slipped it back into the envelope, not because I was done with it, but because I needed it out of sight just long enough to think, to breathe, to remind myself that I was standing in a place where things followed rules, where names and schedules and routines made sense. And yet, even as I set it aside beneath the clipboard, I knew that line had already shifted something in me. Not fear exactly, but awareness sharpened into something quieter, more focused, because this was no longer random. It was intentional, and intention meant there was someone behind it who had already decided to step into my life without asking. And I did not know how to respond to that. So I did what I always do when things stop making sense. I worked. I moved through the morning appointments with steady hands and practiced. Calm, checking vitals, listening carefully, offering reassurance in the same tone I had used 100 times before, because routine creates distance. It builds a wall between you and whatever is waiting outside of it. But that wall felt thinner today, like something could pass through it if it wanted to, and every time the front door opened, I looked up without meaning to. Every time a phone rang, my attention snapped just a little faster than usual, and I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But that thought did not hold for long. Not when the pattern started to shift again, subtle at first, easy to dismiss, like the way a black sedan idled across the street longer than necessary, engine running, windows dark, or the way the receptionist mentioned a delivery that never showed up but had been signed for anyway. Small details that meant nothing on their own, but together they formed something harder to ignore, something that suggested movement behind the scenes. Quiet and controlled, and by early afternoon I could feel it in the air, that same presence from the night before, not visible, not direct, but there, steady and patient, and it made focusing harder than it should have been, not because I was afraid, but because I was waiting without knowing what for, and that kind of waiting stretches time in ways that feel unnatural, until finally, just after 3 o'clock, when the clinic had settled into that brief lull between appointments, the front door opened again, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. And I looked up automatically, expecting another patient, another routine interaction I could manage. But the moment I saw him, everything else fell away, not because he moved differently, but because the space around him seemed to adjust, like the room itself recognized something before I could name it. Tall, composed, dressed in a way that did not demand attention and yet held it anyway. His presence quiet but undeniable, and when his eyes met mine, it was not surprise I felt. It was recognition, not of his face, but of the certainty behind that gaze, the same certainty I had heard in that voice the night before. Calm, measured, and completely in control, and I realized then, standing there with my hand still resting on the edge of the desk, that I had not been imagining it. None of it. Not the car, not the call, not the message. Because the man walking toward me now was the answer to all of it. And something inside me went still, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because this was the moment everything shifted from unseen to undeniable. And when he stopped just a few feet away, close enough that I could hear the steady rhythm of his breath, his voice came exactly the way I expected, low, even, and certain. "Emily Carter," he said, not asking, just confirming. And I knew before he spoke again that whatever came next was not going to be a request. It was going to be a decision already made. The way he said my name did not feel like an introduction. It felt like a conclusion, like he had already traced every step that led me here and was simply confirming the last detail. And for a second I forgot how to respond, not because I did not have words, but because none of them seemed appropriate for a moment that did not follow any normal rules. So I straightened slightly, grounding myself in the familiar space around me. The desk, the clipboard, the steady rhythm of a place that should have remained predictable. "That is me," I said finally, keeping my voice level, even though I could feel the subtle shift in the room. The way conversations behind him quieted without anyone being told to stop, the way attention adjusted without being obvious about it. And he nodded once, like that was all he needed, like confirmation had been a formality rather than a necessity, his gaze steady, not invasive, but precise, The kind that does not wander because it already knows where to look. You helped her, he said, and there was no need to ask who he meant. The image of Lily flashing back instantly, small hands, quiet voice. The cold grip that had not let go until she felt safe, and something in my chest tightened again, protective. Without hesitation, she needed help. I replied, because that was the only answer that made sense to me. The only reason I had stepped into that alley without thinking about anything else. And for the first time, something in his expression shifted, not softer, not warmer, just aware, like he had expected that answer and was measuring it against something only he understood. Most people would have kept walking, he said, his tone still calm, but there was a weight beneath it now, something that suggested observation rather than judgment, and I shrugged slightly, a small movement that felt almost out of place under his attention. Most people were not there, I said, and the words came out more certain than I expected, because in that moment, I realized I did not regret it, not even with everything that followed, not with the call, the envelope, the presence that had threaded its way into my life without warning. And he held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, like he was looking for something deeper than the surface, something that could not be explained in a single sentence. And when he spoke again, his voice lowered just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that it felt directed, intentional. You put yourself in a situation you do not understand, he said, not accusing, just stating, and I felt that same awareness settle in again, heavier now, because he was right. I did not understand any of this, not the car, not the call, not the way he stood here like this was all part of something structured and controlled, and yet I found myself answering anyway. Then explain it, I said, before I could stop myself, because if this was going to continue, if whatever had started last night was not going to simply fade away, then I needed something, context, reason, anything that made this feel less like I was being pulled into something I could not see. And for a moment, just a moment, silence stretched between us again, not empty, but deliberate, like he was deciding how much to say, how much to reveal. And when he finally spoke, it was not an explanation I got. It was something else entirely, something that shifted the ground beneath me in a way I had not expected. The girl you helped, he said slowly, each word measured. She is not a stranger. And I felt my breath catch, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that this had never been random, not for him, not for Lily, not for whatever had unfolded in that alley. And before I could ask the question already forming in my mind, before I could piece together what that meant, his gaze sharpened just slightly, not colder, just more certain, and the next words came, with a quiet finality that left no room for misunderstanding. Which means, he continued, neither are you anymore. The words settled in the space between us heavier than they should have, not loud, not dramatic, just certain, and I felt it again, that shift I could not quite define, like the moment you realize a line has already been crossed, and there is no clear way back. I do not understand what that means, I said, because it was the only honest response left, my voice quieter now, but still steady, and his gaze did not move, did not soften. It simply held mine with that same controlled focus, like he was measuring not just my reaction, but what I would do with it. It means, he replied slow and deliberate, you stepped into something that does not end when you walk away. And I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, not in fear, but in recognition, because that was exactly what it felt like the night had followed me forward instead of staying behind. Like every choice since then had been quietly connected whether I wanted it to be or not. And I shook my head slightly, grounding myself again. I helped a kid, I said, more firmly this time, because I needed to. Hold on to something simple, something that still made sense, that is all. And for the first time, something close to a reaction crossed his face, not disagreement, not correction, just a subtle acknowledgement that I believed that, even if he did not see it the same way. That is not all, he said, and there was no pressure in his voice, no attempt to convince me, just certainty, the kind that does not need to be argued. And I felt a flicker of frustration rise under my ribs, not at him, exactly, but at the situation, at the way everything had shifted without explanation. Then say it clearly, I replied, because if he was going to stand here and speak in half statements and controlled pauses, I needed more than that. I needed something I could actually understand. And for a moment, Just a moment. The silence returned, but this time it felt different, not like hesitation, but like decision. And when he spoke again, his tone did not change, but the weight behind it did. Lily is under my protection, he said, and the words landed with a clarity that cut through everything else. Simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret, and something inside me stilled again, not from fear, but from the realization that this was the piece I had been missing, the connection that explained the car, the call, the envelope, the way everything had been watched, measured, followed, and I felt my posture shift without thinking. More aware now, more focused. Your daughter, I said, because that was the most obvious conclusion, but he shook his head once, precise, controlled. No, he replied, and that single word carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it removed the simplest explanation and replaced it with something more complex, something I could not immediately define. And before I could ask again, before I could push for clarity, he continued, his voice lower now, just enough that the words felt contained between us. But she is mine to protect. And there it was again, that word, not loud, not possessive in the way most people would mean it, but absolute, like a boundary that did not need to be explained to exist. And I felt that same awareness settle deeper, because this was not about coincidence, not about chance. This was structure, control, something built long before I stepped into that alley, and I was now standing inside the edge of it, whether I wanted to be or not. And for a second, just a second, I considered stepping back, creating distance, re-establishing some version of normal, but my feet did not move, because something else had already taken hold, something quieter but stronger than hesitation, curiosity, and maybe something else I was not ready to name. So what does that make me? I asked, and the question came out softer than I intended, but it did not matter, because he heard it exactly as it was meant, and his gaze held mine for a long second, long enough that the air between us felt heavier, more defined, before he answered, not rushed, not uncertain, just clear in a way that left no space to misunderstand. That depends, he said, on whether you choose to stay out of this. A brief pause, controlled, deliberate, or whether you already know you will not. His words did not feel like a question, even though they were shaped like one. They felt like something already decided, like he already knew the answer and was simply waiting to see if I would admit it. And that unsettled me more than anything else he had said, because it meant I was predictable in a way I did not understand. And I held his gaze a second longer than I should have, trying to find something in it. Doubt, hesitation, anything that suggested he was guessing instead of knowing. But there was nothing there except that same quiet certainty. And I exhaled slowly, not out of defeat, but out of realization, because the truth was already sitting in my chest before I said it. If I see something like that again, I said, choosing each word carefully, I am not going to walk away. And the moment the sentence left my mouth, I knew it was the answer he had expected, not because he smiled or reacted, but because nothing about him changed, like this had always been the outcome. And for a brief second, something almost imperceptible shifted in the space between us. Not tension, not relief, something steadier than that, like a line being drawn that neither of us had to acknowledge out loud. And he gave a single nod, small, precise, final. That is what I thought, he said, and there was no judgment in it, no approval either, just confirmation. And I felt that same awareness settle deeper, heavier now, because this was no longer about a single night or a single choice. It was about pattern, about the kind of person I was and the kind of world he existed in, and how those two things had just intersected in a way neither of us was going to undo. And I crossed my arms slightly, not defensive, just grounding myself again. You still have not explained what any of this means for me, I said, because if he was going to make statements about choices and consequences, then I needed clarity, not implications. And for the first time since he walked in, he shifted his weight just slightly, not uncomfortable, just adjusting, like the conversation had reached a point where the answer mattered more than the question. It means, he said slowly, his voice lowering just enough that it felt contained, controlled, that you will be noticed. And something about the way he said that made my chest tighten again, not fear exactly, but recognition, because I already felt it. The way the world outside had changed just enough to be different, the way small details stood out sharper than they should. By who? I asked, even though I was not sure I wanted the answer. And his gaze did not waver, not for a second. By people who do not hesitate, he replied, and the simplicity of that sentence carried more weight than anything else he could have said, because it was not a threat, it was a fact, something already in motion, something that did not need to be dramatized to be real. And I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly against my arms before I forced them to relax, because reacting the wrong way here felt like stepping further into something I did not fully understand. And for a moment I considered stepping back again, distancing myself, drawing a line where none had existed before, but that option felt smaller now, less real, because the truth was already clear. I had been noticed the moment I chose to stay in that alley, and walking away now would not undo that. And he watched me carefully, not pushing, not rushing, just waiting, like he was giving me space to reach the same conclusion he had already accepted. And when I finally spoke again, my voice was quieter, but steadier than before. And you, I said, holding his gaze, you are one of those people. And this time, there was no pause, no hesitation, just a direct answer that landed exactly where it needed to. Yes, he said, and for the first time since this conversation began, something shifted in me that was not tension or uncertainty. It was clarity, sharp and undeniable, because whatever this was, whatever line I had crossed without realizing it, I was no longer standing outside of it. And as the silence settled between us again, heavier now, but not uncomfortable, I understood something I had not fully accepted until this moment, that this was not about being pulled into his world. It was about the fact that I had already stepped into it on my own, and there was no version of this where I could pretend otherwise. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt settled, like something had reached its natural conclusion even if neither of us had said it out loud. And I let my arms fall back to my sides, not because I felt relaxed, but because holding tension any longer felt pointless. The truth was already there, clear and unavoidable, and I took a slow breath, steadying myself against the weight of everything that had shifted in less than 24 hours, because this was no longer about confusion or uncertainty. It was about understanding exactly where I stood, and more importantly, what I was going to do about it. So what now? I asked, and the question came out quieter than before, not weaker, just more focused, because I was no longer asking out of panic. I was asking because I needed to know the rules of something that clearly already existed. And he watched me for a moment, that same measured gaze that never rushed, never revealed more than it chose to. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same controlled calm that had followed me since the night before. Now, he said, you continue your life. And for a second, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it sounded too simple for everything that had just unfolded, too normal for a situation that had stopped being normal the moment I stepped into that alley. And I shook my head slightly. That is not how this feels, I replied, because pretending nothing had changed was not something I could do anymore, not after the call. The envelope, the way he stood here like he had already accounted for every possible outcome, and something in his expression shifted again, not disagreement, just acknowledgement, like he understood the difference between what was said and what was real. No, he agreed. It will not feel the same. And there was no comfort in that statement, no attempt to soften it, just honesty, the kind that does not try to make things easier. And I nodded once, because at least that part made sense. At least that part was something I could trust. And he stepped back slightly then, just enough to create space between us, not distance, just a shift in position that felt intentional, like the conversation was moving toward its end whether I was ready for it or not. But you are not alone in it, he added, and that was the first time his words carried something different, not warmth exactly, but something close to assurance, something that suggested presence rather than control. And I felt that settle in a way I did not expect, not relief, but something steadier, something that made the uncertainty feel less isolating. And I met his gaze again, holding it this time without hesitation, because if I was going to stand in this space, then I needed to do it fully, not halfway. You have been watching me, I said, not as an accusation, just a statement, and he did not deny it, did not deflect. I have been making sure you are not exposed to what you are not prepared for, he replied, and the phrasing caught my attention more than the admission itself, because it implied something ongoing, something that had already extended beyond a single moment, and I let that sit for a second before responding. I did not ask for that, I said, and my voice was steady, not confrontational, just clear, because that mattered, because choice mattered, even now. And for the first time since he walked in, there was a pause that felt slightly different, not hesitation, but consideration, like he was adjusting something in his response. No, he said finally, you did not. And there was no argument in it, no attempt to claim otherwise, just acknowledgement, and that mattered more than I expected, because it meant he understood the line, even if he did not step back from it. And the silence that followed was quieter now, less tense, more defined, like both of us understood exactly where things stood without needing to fill the space with more words. And after a moment, he gave a small nod, the same precise motion as before, final in a way that did not need to be explained, and he turned to leave, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, like he had already said everything he intended to say. And I watched him walk toward the door, the room subtly shifting again. As he moved through it, attention following without being obvious, presence recognized without being named. And just before he reached the exit, he stopped, only for a second, his voice carrying back without him turning around. Next time, he said, calm and measured. Do not put yourself between danger and something you cannot control. A brief pause, just long enough to let the words settle. Unless you are ready for what follows. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft, final sound that echoed more than it should have. And I stood there longer than I realized, staring at the space he had just occupied, feeling the weight of everything settle into something clearer, something more defined. Because this was no longer a question of whether my life had changed. It was a question of how I was going to live inside that change. And as I reached for the envelope still tucked beneath the clipboard, running my fingers over the faint imprint pressed into the paper, I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. That night had not just been a moment, it had been a beginning. And whatever came next was not something I could ignore, only something I could choose to face.